All right. Well, welcome to the True Roots podcast. I'm here with Dan Cox. I'm Andy Harris, and we're just excited to be here. We started talking a few, months ago, I think it was, that just having conversations and not really for a reason for a podcast, but those discussions, we've been talking a lot about just what do men need in this world and what does it look like to follow Jesus and actually follow Jesus as a man. And a lot of things around obedience and surrender and being in the fight. And so we're here today to start talking about that. That's what this podcast is going to be about, is just how do you actually walk towards the Lord as a man? And how do you follow Jesus as a man? And what does that look like? And what does that look like in your community, with your family, with yourself, with your kids? What does it look like to actually be obedient to the Lord? And so that's where we're going to be starting.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So welcome to the podcast. This is Dan, as I said, and I just love to let you introduce yourself and explain a little bit about who you are.
Oh, I get to go first?
You get to go first.
Dude.
Oh,
all
yeah.
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, my name's Dan Cox. I am 36, and I've got 5 kids. 7 years old, well, 7.5, would he probably tell me to say, down to 8 months. So just been in baby mode for the last, fifth of my life. And I have my own business, helping businesses with sales and marketing on the leadership team for a church here in little old Wenatchee, Washington. And I've been walking with the Lord most of my life by the grace of God, not by my ability to stay the course, but because God just wouldn't let me go. And I recently just started having this stirring for the younger men, particularly in our church, but in general. I've always had this desire for discipleship. Yeah. I think I am wired that way. But this season of life that I'm in, I've just watched man after man after man kind of slowly fade. And I don't want to get discouraged by that. I want to change it. So anyways, that's kind of super quick context of who I am, I suppose, without getting into any other details.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. This is the cool part about doing this podcast with you, because our stories are vastly different.
Very much so. Yeah.
But the Lord has spoken into each of our lives and done it in different ways. And just like you said, to lead a family of 5 and to be married and to do it well requires the same faith as coming back to the Lord for what he's done with me. And so my name is Andy Harris, and I have one son, and I am divorced. And God really brought me to my knees about 2 years ago, 2.5, 3 years ago. And I lost a lot. And that's where he found me. And it really shifted so many things in my life in terms of what does it look like. And through that rock bottom experience, I realized that being obedient to the Lord is, and just let me rephrase that. So I've learned from being obedient to the Lord that is where true freedom comes from, and actually being able to walk as a man. And he used my rock bottom experience to do that. And so he's restored my life in so many ways. And now that's where my passion comes from. And the why that I am here is that I want to see men where I was 6 years ago, still married, be able to find the Lord and follow him in the ways that he calls us to, so they don't have to go through the same things that I went through to get there. And we don't have to go through a rock bottom experience to realize what surrender looks like to the Lord, and to realize what that can do for our lives when we surrender to him. And so because I went to the why first instead of who I am, which is what will happen sometimes, especially in the beginning when I'm nervous. But I am 37, and I also own a business, very new business, which is pretty fun. Make some jump ropes on the side too, which is always...
Not very many people can say that.
That's true. You used to do that as well.
You now have a unique resume.
Very true. Just recently led the Word Retreat here in town, which is a retreat for men, and am loving being active in our church as well. So that's kind of just a little bit about me.
Yeah, dude. I was thinking about what you're talking about though, and this desire for men to find, the goodness of a life obeying the Lord before they get to the point that you got to, and the contrast of our stories. But I think the similarity, the thing that we would both acknowledge is like, man, there is an element of intentionality that has to exist regardless of what's come before.
Yeah.
Right. Like looking ahead my simplistic way of thinking before I met my now wife was just like, ooh, I don't like that thing. Let me just try to change the thing. Mm-hmm. And then I'd try to like modify my behavior. Right. And then it would work for a minute. And then I'd like find myself back in the same situation, try a new modification, a new hack, a new thing, but it wasn't deep enough. Right. Yeah. And I think that's what we're after, is this intentionality piece of man, how do you get from surface level understanding of who you are and what you do to the like core of your being and who God has remade you to be, and to start living from that place and understanding, what he's working on and cleaning out so that can all bubble up. Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that you're talking about there too is, the name of the podcast, True Roots. And I had someone speak to me a couple of years ago, great friend of mine, that God was going to start going after the roots in my life. And I think that is exactly what you're talking about, because most of the time, especially in Christianity, especially in churches, we will talk about the sin issue, and that's the problem, when in reality, it's the deeper things underneath that create that problem. Mm-hmm. And then we always want to focus on the problem rather than the root of what that is. And true surrender to the Lord is letting him come in and fix the root, which is much harder. Like facing the problem and looking at it and going, okay, I'm going to face lust. I'm going to go after porn. Well, that's not the issue. It is, but the issue is deeper than that, and it runs deeper than that. And being obedient to the Lord and walking towards those things can get scary as a man, because we start to actually go after the deeper things that are inside of us. And a lot of times we want to stay in this level of things that we can control. Because if I look at a problem, I can control it. But when we start to get to the root of the issues, we have to actually let the Lord in and surrender those things, or we'll never be able to break through and get through those walls.
Yeah, it's like a vulnerability thing too, right? It's like, oh, who am I really? Versus like, what do I want people to see? Or what do I want to let myself see about myself, right? I remember I was dating Rachel, my wife, and we were in an argument. Maybe we may have been engaged at this point. It doesn't matter. It happened when we were dating too. But it was one of the arguments where I got so mad at her, and I'm like yelling, and I don't know if there had been a point in my life, there may have been with my parents or something, where I had gotten that mad. And I had gotten that mad before with Rachel. And I remember thinking in my head, and I may have said it out loud too, but it was, I'm not an angry person, you make me angry. Right? And it was, I think maybe a day or two later, I've realized the just foolishness of that. Like, oh no, that's in me. And she's just close enough to draw it out. And the way that she pushes and presses on things, like draws it out. And, but that's a vulnerable thing to acknowledge about myself versus just like looking at the external thing that was, causing my anger and putting the blame on the external versus like recognizing my part in that situation. Yeah. And doing the work to go, well, why am I getting angry about this thing? Like, what is, like, if she says other things to me, I don't act this way. Like, what is it? And like just starting to like, why? But it like is so much easier to stay here and go, it was your fault. You did it. I'm pretty sure, and we don't have to talk about this, I did that last night. So
so it's a little fresh. Fresh again. Yeah.
Not the anger piece, but the like, I'm just going to stay here at this surface. I'm not going to dig into this. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, when we start to dig into things, we can start to get in that condemnation type piece of it too. But one of the things that you brought into that I think is powerful is curiosity. You start to go, why? And the neat thing when you start to dig into these things is really all Jesus is doing is bringing us back to himself. Mm-hmm. And he wants that deeper relationship. And so as you start to dig into the deeper rooted issues of what's going on inside of you, he's going to bring you back to himself and to community. And I think as men, we look at, hey, if I start to share these vulnerable pieces of myself, which I'm just going to say it, like all men have, and we try to avoid them and we try to act like we don't. We want to stay here. Most men can talk about sports, politics, anything. Like we can talk about lots of surface level things. Job is another good one that we like to talk about. Yeah, very, very good one.
What do you do for work, Andy?
Exactly. Yeah. And I'll also be honest, I actually hate that question because usually I'm like, well, I don't know right now. I'm running a business, trying to get things off the ground. But I'd rather talk about the deeper stuff. But that vulnerability piece is scary to men because we think people are going to leave us. We don't think people are going to step in with us, and we think we're by ourselves. And that's a lie from the enemy that is deeply rooted in not just the world, but in churches as well, saying that we can't enter in. We can only go to a point when full surrender is full surrender. And what I've found in the last 2 years of coming back to the Lord is that the more vulnerable I am, the more community I gain. Mm-hmm. And it's deeper community. And it's not just surface level. I had a lot of community before all of this stuff was wrecked, but the level was not deep.
Totally. Yeah. I think that vulnerability is contagious, right? Like, mm-hmm. So you find when you are vulnerable that it is reciprocated and other people around you are more that way. But it's also this deeper connection point than like what house project you did last week, you know? Because you just start to hear people's hearts. And you have questions that you can ask people, and I just have found when I've lived in seasons where I take things for granted or I assume like things are good or whatever you want to define that like shallow living as, those when I've moved on from that location or season, those relationships don't last, right? They don't stick. Yeah. But the ones where I've like really dove into the intentionality. I mean, I could have been like 15 years ago and I still am in relationship with those people because you just like, you can't, there's no substitute for the deeper level questions and conversations and vulnerability.
Yeah. Well, and talk to a little bit too. You've talked about being in the fight. Like we've talked a little bit about that of what you've seen in men and one of the passions that you have, because you've talked a little bit about how you see men withdraw and they get into their own spaces and then they're not in these spaces to do that. So explain what you mean by that.
Yeah. I mean, I've done it to a degree, right? So when you mature and grow up, when you grow up, you have more responsibilities, and you know every man has varying levels of those, whether that's your workplace and you own a business or you're a manager of people, or maybe it's you have aging parents and you need to take care of them, or maybe you have kids and a wife, and or you've got a volunteer group you're responsible for. Whatever the thing is, there's lots of opportunities for responsibility, and I found the temptation is to fill my time with productivity that again is surface level and use that as an excuse to not walk into the life that Jesus asked me to walk into. And a simple example would be like, okay, I have 5 little kids right now, crazy season in our home. Yeah. There's always someone screaming and always someone that wants my time. And it's a good thing and a right thing to engage with my kids, engage with my wife, but I can use those people as a reason to not be generous with myself and my time outside of my home. Yeah. And there is a very clear call in my life in Scripture to like take care of the poor and the orphan and to love your neighbor. And to, like, I can't ignore those things or justify not doing them because I have kids, right? I have to figure out how to order that. But that takes like a ton of intentionality.
Yeah.
And I just see so many men in this season, as more responsibility gets added, withdraw from engagement and sometimes feeling overwhelmed even with their kids. So maybe they don't go to their family side, they go to their work side, right? Like they almost just pick one thing. And then because of the overwhelmingness of it, or maybe because they feel like they're failing in certain areas, maybe it's their walk with the Lord or as a husband, or they don't open up because it sucks to talk about where you suck.
Yeah.
It's fine to talk about where you're crushing it, And so if they're leaning into work, they'll talk to you all day about their job, right? But you start asking how their marriage is, or like, what are they excited about as a father? Or how are they loving their neighbor? Or what's God teaching them? Yeah. It's like, the answers are minimal at best, Or the conversation just gets awkward.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, let's go back to your job. It's like, what are you going to do next week, And so, anyways.
Oh, no, I appreciate you sharing that, because that's the shift that we want to see within this podcast. I think it's the reason why we're doing this piece.
Yeah.
And what I can hear in that is, where does your identity lie? And that's a big thing for me. Like, my business is called True Roots Identity, and that's really where Jesus shifted everything in my own life, because my identity was in all of those things. And it doesn't mean that your life has to get wrecked like mine did, to be walking a different path than what God has asked us to walk. You could have a lot of success in walking that life in a worldly way.
Yeah.
Like, work looks good, family looks good.
Totally.
And I'm doing okay, money's good. Especially in America, we can have a lot of those things and not be walking the way the Lord wants us to walk, and not have an identity rooted in Him. And so we're not actually free in any of those things. If any of those things fell apart, we're lost.
Yeah.
And that's really what we want to see the shift be. And what I saw is, like, my tagline in my business is change your beliefs, change your behavior, change your life. And really, it's because when your identity is rooted in Christ and truth, then you can start to shift away from the lies that you've believed forever, and get into those vulnerable spaces because you believe His truth, which knows that you don't have to be afraid. You can face those things. You can have His power, and which is a freeing thing for us. But it takes your identity actually being rooted in Him to be able to do that, or we can't go that direction, because we're going to want to keep it in something, and nothing is going to satisfy the longings that we have until we root it in Him.
Yeah.
Which is what we want to do.
It's that classic, maybe it's not classic, I think it's a classic analogy of the lunch tray, right? And they've got like those different slots in the tray, and most people, me, you, like, we have a season where we do this, or we are currently doing this, where the first slot goes to God, and then, we order the other slots, or maybe God's just in a slot, it's like, it's nice that He's there. I have Him in my lunch tray. Yeah. But what's actually supposed to be the case is the lunch tray is supposed to be God, right? He's supposed to be holding all the things, not a slot on the tray, right? And you can't do that apart from surrender.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're now giving, all your things are being held up by God.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is, if that's the case, then some of those things are not going to make the tray.
Yeah.
And you don't get to decide.
Yep.
And so, but it feels good to have God be on the tray. Check the box,
Yep.
But that's just like, that's not it.
Yeah.
It's not it.
Well, and the funny thing with that is that we think we can actually control stuff.
Yeah.
And so we have these boxes that we're going to check, especially as men. We like to put things in boxes. We're really good at that. And so, okay, I can control this. I can control this. I can control God. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to do this. And really what's true is that we're not in control at all.
I know.
And just because our circumstances are decent, we're in control. And we try to walk that way, and we can't. And it doesn't work. And I wanted to get back to this point too that I didn't share earlier, is that because as we go forward, we're going to start to do, we have a 12 episode season that we're going to start doing. And so I wanted to share a little bit about this, but we can see lies a lot of times in our lives, but then we don't actually replace it with truth. And I think that's a big deal. And so we can start to talk to the lies and like, this is a lie. This is something that I believe that I want to let go of. But the only way to do what you're talking about with surrender and with obedience and with walking towards the Lord is to know truth.
Yeah.
Because if we don't know truth, then we're not going to ever believe that doing that is going to be the right move, because we're too afraid to trust it. Like, you can't trust something that you don't believe in. And so we have to root ourselves actually in the truth of that, so that we can walk forward, because you can't walk forward in truth if you don't know truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's I forget how long ago it was. It's probably like 3 years ago or so. Yeah. I had this thought. I think I was just reading the Bible, and I think it was probably something Paul said, but I recognized the change that, like, all the time we'll ask each other, how are you doing with fill in the blank behavior? How are you doing with porn? How are you doing loving your wife? How are you doing with your anger? How are you doing with, greed or whatever it is that's come up? And that's behavior modification, right? Like, but that's like I remember all the way back in high school, like we were talking about, if we were doing okay with our sexual sins, and like that was our check-in period in our small group. And I realized that the actual right question is, how is your faith in fill in the blank promise from the Lord? Like when you think about anger, it's like God promises that he will give you peace. Or and do you believe that? And if you're not believing it, why not?
Yeah.
And like having conversations about the promises of God and why we're struggling to believe them is like, now we're talking about what's really going on, right? Yeah. And instead of just like, okay, I'm anxious today, I'm just not going to be anxious today. Cool, good talk.
Yeah. Yep.
It's not. The next day you're anxious. You did good today, but tomorrow, not so much.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, talking anxiety, you look at the verse that he talks about that, with prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to the Lord. And then he promises his peace.
Yeah. So
don't be anxious about anything. He doesn't say don't be anxious about some things. He says don't be anxious about anything. And in 1 Peter 5:7, it's like, cast your anxieties on him. Like, we're supposed to give those things to him.
Yeah, and Jesus says, don't worry.
Yeah.
Like, end of sentence. And then he gives you some examples of why, and it's like, oh, okay. Do I believe that's true? Like, really, really?
Yeah.
That, like, as he takes care of the sparrows, as he takes care of the flowers, he takes care of me. How much more so? Well, if I look at the way I live my life, no.
Yeah.
And it's like that, and then you go, well, what does that actually look like? And you think, ooh, that's kind of radical. I don't know if I want to be that weird.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if I want to take those risks. And it's like, but that's what Jesus is calling us to, and the level of belief that we're supposed to have in the God who created the universe and calls you by name, right? It's like, okay, I can't compare myself to my peers. I have to compare myself to Jesus and the standards that Jesus puts in front of me.
Yeah.
It's different. That's a different exercise.
It's a way different exercise. And it's his promises too. I think the thing that we think is we have to do it. And it's like, we don't have to do it.
Yeah, is it Philippians 2? He'll give you the desire and the power to do what pleases him.
Yeah, well, and 2 Timothy 1:7 is one of my favorites too, power, love, and self-control, that he gives it. Like, he's given us his spirit. But also when we look at, Galatians 5:22, the fruits of the Spirit, with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all of them, and then self-control at the end. Well, I was on a walk a couple of years ago, and I was like, Lord, I'm actually starting to walk in self-control. Why have I never had self-control until now? And he's like, it's the fruit of the Spirit, and you didn't have the Spirit. It's like it only comes from him.
Yeah.
And it says that we got to abide in him. Like the fruit will come from abiding in him. And so we don't have to go earn it. We don't have to go make it happen. We've got to surrender it. And then we have to walk towards what he says and believe that that's the truth. Because that's the thing, like you're talking about. If this is true, which it is, then it should impact every way that I live. It doesn't mean that I won't get anxious at times. It doesn't mean that I won't worry at times, because this is a process of sanctification. But if he says don't be anxious about anything, and he says to present these things to him, then that's what I need to do. And if he promises peace, he will give it. And he does.
Yeah.
He will do that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was not the one who conquered lust in my life. So I want to say this in a funny way, but when I say I conquered lust, the way that it happened is by saying, Lord, I don't know how I'm going to stop doing this. I ask for self-control from your Spirit. Please give me your Spirit and show me how to do this. And one of the prayers that I still pray if I'm ever tempted is like, Lord, I give you my sexuality, whatever you want to do with it. And please help me in this weakness. And it brings back to another spot where his power is made perfect in weakness. And so we should boast about our weaknesses, which is another piece of it. Like if we're not boasting about our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities, then we're actually denying his power in our life. Because it's made perfect when we share those. Like Paul goes on to say that I'll share, I'm going to boast about him because of that. And I know I'm going in a few different directions, but it's like that's the cool thing about the Lord is that when we start to surrender and walk towards him, now the power is not on me. I don't have to do it. I just got to be obedient and just do what he asks and live into the truth that he says. And now I can walk forward as a free man. And that's what he wants.
Yeah. Yeah. It's counterintuitive, right? Like there is work in the sense that you have to give it to the Lord. And then in surrendering, you're saying yes to the things that he asks of you, right? So there is this like effort that comes, but the immediacy is not behavior modification. It's hear God. It's the woman who's washing Jesus' feet and says, or doesn't say anything. And Jesus says about her, who has been forgiven much loves much, right? She had this deep understanding of her need for Jesus. And so she could receive all that love. When I think I'm capable on my own, I can't receive all that Jesus wants to give me. Yeah. And so it's like, man, what an opportunity. More of Jesus. But it is in that surrender piece, which is uncomfortable. Like there is no way surrender isn't uncomfortable, because like we've said before, there's like no control in surrender. Yeah. So just get used to being uncomfortable.
Well, he says, pick up your cross and follow me. That's not a comfortable place to walk.
Nah.
And I'll just wrap it up here with saying that as you were talking about that, it just reminded me of a picture. Like when we're taking control of our life, we're doing this. This is what we're trying to do, is to hold on to everything like this and do it ourselves. Well, you can't receive anything in your hand when you're holding it like this. And so that act of surrender to allow Jesus in to actually do things in our lives and to receive the gifts that he has for us, to receive the promises that he has for us, we actually have to let go of doing that. We have to have an open hand. And that act of surrender allows us now to get into the fight, because we're going to actually be able to receive his Spirit and walk in his Spirit, because we've said, okay, I can't do it on my own. I surrender. And then he shows up.
Yep. So is that where you're landing the plane?
That's where I'm landing the plane, I think, today. We have our episodes. We can get into, they'll be dispelling lies, replacing with truth, ownership. We're going to go through a lot of different things, how to lead a family, all of those things.
Yeah. So. Yeah. All with the desire to obey and walk with Jesus. And so, I don't know how you want to close an episode, but got any fun zingers to send them out?
That's a great question. This is episode 1, so we're going to be learning a little bit. I just want to end with this. I think obedience is something that we look at as a negative thing in our world. But when we surrender and obedient to the Lord, obedience brings blessing. Obedience or precedes blessing is what I should say. And obedience to the Lord is the best decision you'll ever make in your life, because when we're obedient to him and we listen to him and we do what he asks, we will become the most free we've ever been in our lives. And we think that obedience, especially as a man, we want to go do things on our own. We want to be in control, that word is a negative, but that word's the most positive thing that we could do. And I don't know if this is necessarily where I wanted to land the plane, but to say, hey, Jesus, you're now in control. I surrender, and anything you want to do with my life, you can do. Yeah, it might seem like a scary prayer, but it's actually the most freeing prayer that you could ever pray. So that's where I want to end today. If you haven't done that yet, get on your knees today and just say, I surrender. Doesn't matter where you're at in your walk, I surrender, and watch what the Lord's going to do. That's where we're going to end.
Bang. Mission accomplished.